Hello there, my name is Tim Berger. I'm a former alcoholic and drug addict, but now I'm a speaker. I'm usually in the classroom talking to kids face to face, but because of virtual reality, we're doing it this way today. I hope you do think about the concepts that we're going to present today. I grew up in the Boston area. I now live in the state of Maine. But I'd like to take you outside of New England to a place called Phoenix, Arizona. It was a very hot day in Phoenix. In fact, it was over 100 degrees when I got out of work. The first thing I thought about was getting myself a nice cold drink. So I went down to the local Circle K and I picked up a 6-pack of Colt 45 malt liquor. I popped the top, I drank one down, and I headed on home. I was 22 years old at the time. I was married and the father of 2 children. When I got home that night, I sat down to supper with the wife and the kids. As I sat down, the phone rang. It was my friend Evan. Evan had been out to the Indian reservation earlier that day, and he said he had something he wanted to show me. I asked him about it over the phone, but he said, "No, just come on out to the house." So I went out to Evan's house that night. I knocked on his door. I walked in, and there was Evan sitting on the couch smoking a joint, a reefer, a marijuana cigarette. I sat down beside him and we polished off that joint together. When it was gone, I started laughing. I said, "Evan, I didn't come all the way out here tonight just to blow some weed, did I?" He said, "Oh no." And he reached into his pocket and he pulled out this thing called peyote. I said, "What's peyote?" He said, "Peyote is a cactus plant." He said, "It grows here in the Southwest." He said, "The Indians do it all the time." I said, "Well, how do you do it? Do you smoke it?" He said, "No, you just eat it." So I chewed on it, I swallowed it, and I waited. About an hour went by. I couldn't feel anything. I could feel the effects of the alcohol I was drinking. I could feel the effects of the marijuana I had smoked, but I couldn't feel anything from this peyote. 2 hours go by. I'm getting nervous now, so I decide to go home. When I get home that night, I quietly crawled into bed. I'm laying there just about ready to go to sleep when all of a sudden I noticed a tingling sensation come across the left side of my face. It worked its way down into my neck and into my chest, and by the time it got to my leg, I could actually feel the blood rushing through my veins and arteries. Yeah, I was scared. I jumped out of bed. I went into the living room. I sat on the couch. I began to sweat. I remember looking outside the window at the streetlights before I got sick to my stomach, dropped to my knees, and crawled into the bathroom, just in time to throw up. I had the dry heaves for about 20 minutes before I finally passed out on the floor. I woke up the next morning about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I remember saying to myself as I woke up, how did I ever get myself into this mess? I mean, just a few years earlier, I was a top student in high school. Let me take you back to my high school days. A little town just north of Boston. A town ironically named Stoneham, Stoneham, Massachusetts. As a freshman in high school, I was on the honor roll, I was on the basketball team. You could say I was one of the more likely to succeed of all the kids in my freshman class. But between my freshman year and my sophomore year, I started drinking that stuff called beer. I hated the taste, but I liked the buzz, I liked the feeling. By the time I was a junior, I was drinking whiskey, and as a senior in high school, I was a teenage alcoholic. Couldn't go to a dance, couldn't go to a football game, couldn't go out on a date without having a few drinks first. The alcohol seemed to change my personality. I was kind of a shy, quiet kid normally, but when I drank, I was more the life of the party. I could sing, I could dance, I could even talk to girls without getting nervous. Alcohol became my chemical crutch that I used to hobble through that period of life called adolescence. And though I did graduate from high school, I flunked out of college. My first semester in college, I took 5 courses. I flunked 4 out of 5. So they kicked me out of the school. I ended up instead going to an aircraft mechanics school. I figured if I couldn't make it as an engineer at a regular college, maybe I could be an aircraft mechanic. I did pretty good at that school. I get an A in basic machine tools. I get a B in welding, a B in sheet metal. I get an A in electricity. I got a B in jet engines. Everything was going great until I met Mary Jane. No, I'm not talking about a girl. I'm talking about pot, grass, weed, reefer. Marijuana became the love of my life. And under the influence of pot, I got lazy. All I wanted to do was sit around and listen to music and get high. I go to class, I'd sit in the back of the room, I'd laugh and giggle and have a great time, but I never learned anything. I go to shop in the afternoon, I take apart the jet engines. I usually end up spinning the compressor blades like, wow, man, look at that. Under the influence of pot, I lost my academic focus and I dropped out of the school. I quit. 2 months before I was to graduate, I quit the school. Like, what a stupid thing to do. Why do you think they call it dope? I quit the school and I started hanging out at the beach. Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, and Playa del Rey. It was at Playa del Rey that I met this girl. We started smoking pot together. We started drinking wine together. We started doing a few other things together we should not have been doing. 2 months later, she told me she was pregnant. She was 18, I was 19, and we had to decide, what are we going to do? What are we going to do with a little baby yet to be born? Back then, you had two options. You could either get married or put the baby up for adoption. Abortion was against the law. My son, by the way, is very thankful. Abortion was against the law. He was born in Springfield, Massachusetts. I got a job working on dishwashers in restaurants. I'd go around to restaurants, hotels, hospitals, even some schools, fixing the dishwashers in the cafeteria. The job paid very good money, but I got laid off the job, and it came at a bad time because my wife was now pregnant with baby number 2. With the second baby on the way, we decided to move. We moved to Phoenix, Arizona. And while we were living in Phoenix, my brother-in-law came over to the house one night with this high-grade marijuana. Super weed. I mean, very strong stuff. We were smoking it, my wife and I both. We were smoking it for about 3 weeks, 21 days, every night. One night she came up to me and said, "Hey, Tim, I'm starting to bleed." I said, "You're pregnant. You're not supposed to bleed." She said, "I know something's wrong." So I took her down to the doctor. The doctor told her to go to the hospital. She checked into the hospital on a Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday, the bleeding stopped. Friday morning, I get a call from the doc saying, "Everything's okay. Come on down and pick up your wife. Take her back home." Well, I went down to the hospital to pick her up. When I got there, I was expecting to see her all dressed and ready to go. She was still in bed. I said, "Honey, what's the matter?" She said, "I just had a contraction." I said, "You had a what?" She said, "A labor pain." I ran down the hall, told the nurse. The nurse called the doctor. 10 minutes later, a little tiny baby was born. The baby only weighed 3 pounds. The baby couldn't breathe very well. So they put the baby in an ambulance and they rushed her across town to a different hospital. It was there at St. Joseph's Hospital on Camelback Avenue in Phoenix that she spent the next 42 days in an incubator. They had a tube going down her nose to feed her. They had oxygen coming in the other side. She was in that incubator for 6 weeks. Yeah, 42 days. Every morning and every night we go to the hospital to see how she was doing. She lost weight, went down to 2.5 pounds before she finally gained enough weight to come home. Now, I asked the doctor shortly after the baby was born, what caused the baby to be born early? He explained it to me like this. He said the reason the baby was born early was because the placenta separated from the uterus. That's what caused the bleeding, and that's what triggered the premature birth. I said, "Okay, doc, that makes sense to me, but what causes the placenta to separate from the uterus?" He didn't know. He said it usually happens when a woman falls down a flight of stairs, is involved in an auto accident, or has some other kind of an injury. I said, "Nothing like that happened to my wife." He said, "I know." He said, "But sometimes this condition may occur and there's no logical medical explanation. He said, in your case, we don't know what caused it. We just don't know. Well, the baby came home. She seemed to be healthy. So to be honest with you, I sort of forgot about the conversation I had with the doctor. It wasn't until about 5 years later that I finally discovered what probably caused the premature birth. Now, it was 1 year after the baby was born that I did the peyote. I only did it once. It was 2 years after the baby was born that I moved to Connecticut. And there in Connecticut, about 3 years after the baby was born, I met this guy at a local hardware store. His name was Mike. Mike invited me to a volleyball game, and I started playing volleyball once a week with Mike and his friends. I found out pretty quickly that Mike and his friends, they didn't smoke or drink, they didn't do drugs, they went to church every week. They were involved in something called the Community Service Center, where they passed out food and clothing to poor people. Well, I kept hanging out with these guys, and I began to realize that the greatest joy in life doesn't come from getting stoned, bombed, or wasted, but rather from helping other people. Well, I kept going to church, read the Bible. I got involved with the scouting organization. I cut down on my drinking. I cut down on my smoking. It took me about a year before I finally quit. The pot went first. The booze went second. Finally, I quit smoking the cigarettes. That was the hardest one of all to quit, was the cigarettes. But when I quit smoking the cigarettes, I got involved in a stop smoking program called the 5-Day Plan. And the 5-Day Plan to stop smoking was designed to help people to quit in 5 days. If you follow the program, they say, after 5 days, you can rid yourself of the addiction. So I went to this 5-day plan. I shared my own experience with the people. And little by little, I felt impressed to be a speaker myself. So I started doing these 5-day plans. And then one day I met this guy that was a head of a drug prevention program. The drug prevention program was centered around a magazine called Listen. And this Listen magazine was designed to help young people to make better choices, better than smoking or drinking or using drugs. Well, I got involved with this program, and I started going around to the schools in Connecticut, and they liked the magazine, and one teacher asked me to come in and speak to their kids. So I went into their classroom and spoke to the kids, and I've been doing it ever since. Last year I did over 300 talks in schools in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Connecticut. I'm very grateful that I've had a second chance in life. There are so many of my peers that died from overdoses. So many of my friends that never finished college and never got the jobs that they could have had otherwise. I shudder to think what could have happened to me if that peyote experience was a positive one. Thankfully, it was so negative that I never wanted to touch anything stronger. I never did heroin. I never did coke. I never did crack. I never did ecstasy or acid or any of those popular drugs of the time. But I did a lot of cigarettes, a lot of alcohol, and a lot of marijuana. And it affected me. It affected my brain. I believe it affected my brain in such a way that I'll never regain the kind of intellectual or social ability that I would have had otherwise. Yeah, I'm thankful I've had a second chance in life, but it's cost me a lot. It cost me a college education. It cost me a marriage. Oh, I didn't tell you this. Yeah, my wife, she tried to quit. She quit for about a year, but then she went back to drinking again and smoking again, and eventually she left me and got a divorce, and as far as I know, she continues to drink and smoke. My decision to smoke and drink cost me a college education, it cost me a marriage, it cost me the health of my kids. 3 out of my 4 kids have had drug and alcohol problems themselves. The little girl that was born early, she had the worst of it. About 5 years after she was born, I read an article in a magazine. The magazine article was about a research study done at the University of Mississippi. Apparently, the university was given a government contract to grow, test, and analyze marijuana. They gave it to rats, they gave it to mice, they gave it to monkeys, they even gave it to humans who volunteered for the experiment. And this is what they discovered. They found that THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, the active ingredient in marijuana, can cause a separation of the placenta and the uterus, causing premature birth. Well, when I read that article, I pretty much had the answer to the question I had asked the doctor several years before. I don't think it was just a coincidence, do you? That 3 weeks prior to the birth of the baby, we were smoking that high-grade marijuana for 21 days straight just before the baby was born. No, I don't think it was a coincidence. I think it's what they call in science cause and effect. The cause was the marijuana, the effect was the premature birth. And that little baby had problems growing up. I won't go into all the details, but right now she's doing better than she ever has. People often ask me, well, how did you quit? Did you go to a rehab? Nope. Did you go to an AA meeting? Not yet. Well, then how did you quit? Well, behind me you see a sign. If you look at that sign, it says New Start, going from top to bottom. And each of those letters in New Start stands for something that I now do every day in order to maintain my sobriety. Number 1, eat healthy food, nutrition. Without good healthy food, your body's going to be stressed out. You're always going to be looking for a shortcut, like smoking or drinking or using drugs. What is good food? Well, I believe the best diet is a vegetarian diet. Lots of fruits and nuts and grains and vegetables. Plant-based food is the easiest for the body to digest, to assimilate, and to put into the body's cells the nutrients that are essential for a happy and healthy life. The second step in the New Start program is exercise. I like to exercise at least an hour every day. Walking, running, mountain climbing, playing golf, playing tennis, getting involved in physical exercise. Because exercise not only helps the body, it also helps the brain, helps the mind, helps the emotions. It really helps to relieve stress. The W in New Start stands for my favorite drink. No, it's not whiskey. It's not wine. The W stands for water. How essential is water? Well, your body is about 70% water, and you're constantly losing it through perspiration, urination, respiration. That's right, just breathing. It takes about 1.5 pints of water every day. If you don't replace the water that you lose, you're going to feel the negative effects. You're going to feel down, you're going to feel depressed, you're going to feel like you want to pop a pill, smoke a joint, or do something else to make you feel better. But what you really need is more water. The S in New Start stands for sunlight. Sunlight triggers a mechanism in the brain that makes you feel good naturally. That's why people who live in cloudy, gloomy, rainy climates have a higher rate of depression, a higher rate of suicide, and a higher rate of drug use too. It has to do with vitamin D. When sunlight strikes the skin, vitamin D is produced, and vitamin D helps to control a chemical in the brain called serotonin, and that chemical serotonin makes you feel good naturally. The T in New Start stands for temperance. That word means 2 things. Number 1, temperance means staying away from harmful substances like alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. Temperance also means using in moderation things that are good. I mean, if an apple a day keeps the doctor away, would eating a whole bushel be even better? No, because your body can only assimilate so much of a good thing. In America, we have a terrible disease of obesity. Just too much food can cause problems with the organs and with the stress levels of a person as well. So eat good, healthy food, exercise every day, drink a lot of water, get a proper amount of sunlight, and stay away from drugs and alcohol. Those are the first 5 steps in the New Start program. The A in New Start stands for fresh air, oxygen. I mean, think about it. You can live about 40 days without food, about 11 days without water. How long can you live without air? About 2 or 3 minutes. That's all. It's essential to get good oxygen into your lungs. That's why I always sleep with the window cracked at night, even in the wintertime, to get a little bit of oxygen, fresh air into the room all the time. And that's why I like to exercise outside. I mean, some of you like to exercise indoor at a gym or on a treadmill, and that's okay, but it's better to exercise outside. The R in New Start stands for rest. How important is a good night's sleep? Very important. Without a good night's sleep, it's hard to function. The body needs that time to recharge its batteries. If you don't get a good night's sleep, you won't have the energy, the stamina, or the courage to lead a good, healthy life. Rest is also important for me once a week. Every Saturday, I take the day off. I usually go to church, spend time with my friends, and sometimes take a walk in nature. The T in New Start maybe is the most important of all. The T stands for a word that's on the back of every dollar bill. The word is trust. That little phrase, "In God we trust," motivated me to put my belief, my hope, and my trust in a higher power, a power whom I choose to call God. And that power, combined with these other concepts of health, have given me a new start in life. And so far, it's worked. I've had 45 years now of sobriety. No cigarettes, no alcohol, no pot for that long. But I wouldn't be here today if it were not for my new friends that told me about New Start. At this point in my talk, if I was with you face to face, I'd ask for questions. But since I can't do that through this media, I'm going to read some of the typical questions that students ask me after my talk. Number 1, what happens to your body when you use drugs? Well, I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but I've read enough to understand quite clearly the harmful effects of smoking. This photograph shows 2 different lungs, one that is healthy and one that is not. The healthy lung was taken from a guy who never smoked. He did live in Chicago, so he had some black spots on his lung, probably caused by air pollution or secondhand smoke. This guy, on the other hand, smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day. He died at age 45 of a disease called emphysema, or COPD. Emphysema usually occurs when the air sacs inside of the lung break up. And as the air sacs break up, these bubbles form. And once those bubbles form, it's very difficult to breathe. You can breathe in okay, but you can't breathe out. You're constantly huffing and puffing and gasping for air. Most people with emphysema have to be hooked up to artificial oxygen, carry a little tank around with a tube that goes up to their nose. There is no cure for emphysema. Once you get it, you'll have it for the rest of your life. You can't ride a bike, you can't play sports, you can't even walk across a room without stopping halfway to catch your breath. My grandfather died of emphysema, and yes, he was a cigarette smoker. In fact, I hate to admit this, but one year, I was about 12 years old, I bought a carton of cigarettes for my grandfather for Christmas. Another disease caused by cigarette smoking is lung cancer. Lung cancer, like emphysema, starts out with tar buildup. The black stuff you see here is tar from the cigarette smoke. But the tar irritates the lung to a degree where these tumors begin to form. And once those tumors begin to form, it's very difficult to breathe. This lung is a healthy lung with the black spots. Now, it's better not to live in a city, but if you have to live in a city, try to go outside when the air pollution isn't so bad. A third disease caused by cigarette smoking is heart disease. Heart disease occurs when the coronary arteries get plugged up. These blood vessels that look like the roots of a tree, they get plugged up with a substance called cholesterol. Cholesterol is found in foods that come from animals. More animal food that you eat, the greater risk of heart disease you will have. Heart disease usually occurs as the arteries get plugged. This photograph shows arteries in various stages of blockage. This is a healthy artery. This one was probably taken from a vegetarian, maybe even a vegan. This one has a little bit of cholesterol. This one has a lot. This one has so much that the artery that was once this big, it's now about half its normal size. And it's getting smaller and smaller until eventually it'll get plugged up. And when it gets plugged up, that's when you have a heart attack, cardiac arrest. The sad news is that thousands of Americans will die today as a result of heart disease, a disease that could have been prevented. That's why it's so important not to smoke, not to drink, and to eat healthy food. Another question that people ask me is, what happens to your body when you drink alcohol? Well, alcohol first and foremost affects the brain. Studies show that alcohol kills brain cells. They've done autopsies on alcoholics and found that the alcoholic brain is about 25% smaller than the normal brain. The brain actually shrinks every time a person drinks. Another organ that's greatly damaged by drinking alcohol is the liver. The liver is the body's filter. This is a healthy liver, taken from a guy who never drank. This guy drank 2 to 3 drinks a day every day for about 20 years. 20 years of moderate to heavy drinking caused his liver to fail. And a failed liver means you can't digest your food properly, and it also poisons the blood. Another question that is asked is, what does marijuana do? Well, marijuana, like cigarettes, is smoked. And think about it. When you smoke pot, you breathe it deeply, and you hold it in your lungs for a longer period of time. That extra time enables the lungs to absorb more of the tar, more of the resin, and more of the pollutants found in the smoke. Marijuana also affects the immune system. Early studies of marijuana show that THC can effectively reduce the ability of the white blood cell to fight disease. Marijuana also can affect the reproductive organs. As I mentioned before with my daughter, the reason she was born early is because her parents were smoking pot during the pregnancy. Another question that people ask was, when was your first cigarette smoked? Well, it happened in the 7th grade. I remember it just like it was yesterday. I was ice skating with some friends at an ice skating rink in Melrose, Massachusetts. After we were done ice skating, I started walking home. I actually was walking to the bus stop where I was going to take the bus home. But while I was waiting at the bus stop, a couple of my schoolmates came by and said, "Hey, we're going to take a shortcut home through the woods. You want to come with us?" So we said, okay, me and my friends. I think there was a total of 5 of us, and we were walking through the woods, and this one guy named Chuck, he pulled a cigarette out of his pocket and started smoking, and about 2 minutes later he turned around and asked me if I wanted a cigarette. Well, I didn't really want the cigarette, but I wanted to be cool because Chuck was one of the cool guys in the class. And so I took the cigarette and I started choking and coughing, and oh, I hated doing it, but I got used to it and I felt like I was cool, felt like I fit in. That was the main reason why I think I started, was because I wanted to get accepted by the other people in the school. But I got hooked. And I ended up smoking cigarettes for 10 years. Only had a couple in the 7th grade, a few in the 8th grade. By the time I was in the 9th grade, I was smoking about a pack and a half a day. Well, at least a pack or a half a pack a day is what I meant to say. When was your first drink of alcohol? It happened at a lake in New Hampshire. I was camping out with my parents that summer, and we had done a lot of water skiing around this island out in the middle of the lake, me and my friend Bruce. Well, Bruce and I were looking at this island as we were water skiing around it, and Bruce suggested that we go camping out on the island that night. Well, we set up our tents and our sleeping bags and all of our gear. We caught a few fish, we cooked them up on the campfire, and then about 8 o'clock at night, a boat from the other side of the lake came closer and closer to the island. A couple of college kids jumped out of the boat, said they were going to camp out on the island too. Well, we didn't own the island, and besides, they were bigger than us, so we didn't give them the hassle. They came over and set up their camp next to ours. Then they go back to their boat. They pull out this big old box, set it down, opened it up, pulled out 4 6-packs of beer. They start popping the tops and passing them around. I ended up with a can of beer in my hand for the first time in my life. My parents didn't drink beer, so I never saw it in the refrigerator, but I saw the commercials on television, so I knew what to do. I popped the top. I took a sip. Oh, people actually pay money to drink this stuff? I couldn't believe how bad it tasted. But I drank it anyway because I wanted to be cool. Oh, it's great, I said. It's great. Give me another one. 2.5 beers later, I started getting dizzy. I started bumping into pine trees. I started crawling around on my hands and knees, digging holes in the ground, looking for mice. No, I never found any. I went back to school the next year as a sophomore. Started hanging out with a different group of friends. Started hanging out at the pool room every Friday and Saturday night. Smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, and, well, getting into trouble. And it all started with that very first drink. Another question that people ask is, when was your first marijuana joint? The first time I ever smoked pot was my first year in college. I only did it one time that year. I can still remember I was in the dormitory room with about 3 or 4 other guys, and I was sitting up on the bunk beds, and we had all been drinking earlier in the day, and now later at night somebody pulled out a marijuana cigarette, and they lit it up and started passing it around, and they handed it to me up at the top of the bunk. So I took that marijuana cigarette and I smoked it, and to be honest with you, I didn't really feel very much. Maybe because my body hadn't built up enough THC to get into my system. That first time, I didn't get very high. Or maybe it was because I was so drunk that I never could feel the effects of the marijuana. But then when I went to the aircraft mechanics school the next year, that's when I started smoking pot on a regular basis. Another question that is asked is, did peer pressure play a part in your decision to use drugs? Yes, to some degree, although I would rather call it peer influence, because nobody really ever pressured me to take drugs. I was curious, I wanted to fit in, and yes, I gave in to that feeling and started. that was a bad decision because I was the one who got hooked. Another question that people ask me is, did peer pressure play a part in your recovery? Well, yeah. Just like peer pressure affects you negatively, if you hang out with people that are into drugs, peer pressure affected me positively when I hung out with people who were not into drugs. They were involved in community activities helping people to feel better. And that made me feel good inside. It definitely replaced my desire to smoke and drink and use drugs. Somebody over at a high school in Berlin, New Hampshire asked me this question, and she said, "Can you forgive yourself for all the bad that happened as a result of your drug use?" Well, it's not easy. It's easier for me to forgive others. It's a lot harder to forgive myself. But I must forgive myself in order to move on and to be the best person I can be today. It's like that phrase that goes like this: forget about yesterday because it's already happened, and don't worry about tomorrow, for today is the first day of the rest of your life. Speaking of life, what is the purpose of your life? That's another question that kids ask me. What is your purpose now? What do you do? What is your job? Well, I'm a full-time drug prevention speaker. And the reason I do it to help others, but I also do it to help myself. Every time I speak in front of a group, I reinforce my decision not to smoke, not to drink, and not to do drugs. Another question that people ask is, how'd you get started? Well, I really got started when I was 4 years old. What drug did I use when I was 4 years old? I was a big-time sugar addict. I couldn't wait for Halloween and Christmas, Valentine's Day and Easter. Sugar became my drug of choice when I was 4 years old. When I was about 12 years old, I started drinking coffee. I went from sugar to caffeine, caffeine to cigarettes, cigarettes to alcohol, alcohol to pot, and pot to peyote. And I'll say it again, if that peyote experience was a positive one, if I had enjoyed it, I might have gone on to other drugs like heroin, crack, or cocaine. I'm going to close this program today with one last question. The question that is asked me is, how much money did you lose because of drugs? I don't know. I've never figured it out completely, but let me try to guesstimate the amount of money that I have spent. I figured I spent about $5,000 over a 10-year period smoking cigarettes, smoking marijuana, and drinking alcohol. About $5,000. But add to that $10,000 more. That's what it cost for the baby to be born early. 42 days in the hospital was over $10,000. Add to that the $6,000 that my parents wasted on my college education. I drank myself out of one school, I smoked myself out of the other. Add to that the $4,000 that I spent on my ex-wife's rehab. 28 days in the rehab center was over $4,000. If you add that up, the $5,000 for the drugs themselves, the $10,000 for the baby to be born early, the $6,000 for my parents' cost of education, and the $4,000 that I spent on my ex-wife's rehab, that's a total of $25,000 directly related to drug use. Now, $25,000 seems like a pretty good chunk of change, but that's not all that it cost. Think about this. If I'd have graduated from my first college and received my degree, I'd be making about $200,000 a year as a thermonuclear engineer. That was the course of study I had hoped to pursue, thermonuclear engineering. But I drank myself out of that school. Instead, I ended up fixing dishwashers and doing drug education, averaging $20,000 a year instead of $200,000. If you take the difference between $200,000 and $20,000, that's a difference of $180,000 per year. You multiply that by 50, the approximate number of years I've worked in my lifetime, it ends up to be a total of about $9 million. Was it worth it? I think not. Thank you very much.